My guest at this time is former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford. Earlier this week, Governor Sanford announced he was ending his campaign for the Republican presidential nomination. He had admitted from the beginning of the campaign that actually winning was pretty unlikely against an incumbent, but he wanted to do everything possible to get the nation focused on the problem of runaway federal deficits and debt. For the next few moments, we'll find out how Americans responded to that message. And Governor Sanford, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting me join you.
Why did you decide to end the campaign now?
Because all the oxygen was being sucked out of the room by impeachment, and I'm not into wasting my time or anybody else's. It was a long-shot campaign from the very beginning. If you look at the history of challenging a sitting president of your own party, it doesn't work out well for the challenger. And I'd acknowledge that, saying, wait a minute, the purpose here is simply to raise and elevate a debate that needs to take place in this presidential election about how do we pay for all of this stuff. I mean, what do we believe on debt and deficit and government spending? What are its implications for our lives? And in as much as I could have that debate and try and encourage that into the portfolio of different things that are being discussed, it was worthwhile. When impeachment came along, I saw my chances of doing that diminish to the point of it not working. So I said, I don't want to waste people's time. And I look for other ways of raising this issue, which is why I appreciate so much our time together right now.
What's it like to be invited on cable news shows? Because I saw you did a number of interviews during your campaign, and then you get there and you get asked about virtually everything under the sun except the issue you want to focus on.
It is wildly frustrating because we are being distracted by so many silver and gold coins out there, all kinds of shiny objects, and we are missing the fact that we're walking toward the most predictable financial crisis in the history of our nation and having not one sentence about it at the presidential level. On the Democratic side, where it's a debate of more versus more, and on the Republican side, where it's sort of, I hear no evil, I see no evil, I speak no evil, maybe go away, but we're running record levels of deficit. We've never before in our nation's history run $1 trillion deficit in benign economic times and peacetime, but that's exactly what we're doing right now.
What kind of reaction did you get from actual Americans? Not to say that the media is not actual Americans, but if you talk to different groups, whether it's in your home state of South Carolina or up in New Hampshire or Iowa or wherever you ended up going, how engaged were they on the issue?
People are engaged. People get it. People get real numbers. I mean, we took actually drove across the country, and the kids were bankrupt, and we didn't even know it tour. That's what we called it. And, you talk to real folks, and they get it because, they got to balance the family checkbook. And as a little business person, you got to balance the little business checkbook. And they don't get it the way that, nobody's talking about the fact of what they can see in terms of the writing on the wall. But in fairness to, folks that work in the media, I get it. Impeachments don't come along often. There have been two in the history of our country, and I guess I get it in the way that we're going to talk about that and a bunch of other things. But we're doing a grave disservice to folks that are going to get hurt in this. I mean, Admiral Mike Mullen was the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and when asked, what's the biggest threat to American security? And this is from a military person. He answers, not the Taliban, not the Russians, not the Chinese. His answer was the American debt, and he was exactly right. And at some point in the body politic, we got to acknowledge that fact.
We're talking with former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford, and until this week was a candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. As you went on this tour, I don't know, what was the exact title? Our Kids Are Bankrupt and Don't Even Know It tour?
No. Kids, we're bankrupt and we didn't even know it because we're the ones jamming on our kids $1 trillion debt. You know what $1 trillion deficit is? A deficit is nothing more than a deferred tax. Now, you can come up with different ways of financing it. Are we going to raise taxes? Are we going to borrow some more money? I mean, you can come up with a lot of different ways of financing it, but it's nothing more than a deferred tax. And our country, in part, was founded on this notion of no taxation without representation. It is generationally immoral to do what we're doing right now to kids because some measure of the American dream is being robbed from them as they get stuffed the bill for $1 trillion worth of government that was consumed this year that didn't particularly accrue to their benefit, but they get the tab for it.
So, Governor, what was your pathway to solving the problem? You obviously calling attention to the problem is the first thing to do, and then explaining that you have a way to address it is the second part. So what were you telling folks about the most successful way to deal with numbers that big?
I mean, you're dead on. I mean, the first part of fixing a problem is acknowledging that you have a problem. And right now, if you were to go down any main street in anywhere USA, because we're social beings, there was a great book years ago written, it was entitled Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And what it talked about was fundamentally we're almost like antelope on the plains of the Serengeti. You cannot make every decision out there. And so a lot of it is based on social cues. We look to the left, we look to the right. If they're not that alarmed about a lion coming our way, I guess a lion's not coming our way, and we continue to graze there on the plains of the Serengeti. And it's the same for us as human beings. We do get social cues. And so I think the first part, to your point, is acknowledging that we have a real problem. I mean, the fact that the national debt is going up by $100 million an hour is just, I mean, a fairly remarkable thought. I mean, you can come up with all kinds of weird numbers and statistics, but the bottom line is, one, acknowledge that you have a problem, and two, offer a remedy. And so in my case, when I was in Congress, I offered a bill called the penny plan. And Einstein was once asked, what's the most powerful force in the universe? And his reply was compound interest. It works while you're sleeping. And so this bill takes to advantage the power of compounding in the reverse direction. Instead of toward growing government, it's toward limiting government. So if we all got in the boat together as Americans, if we recognize that we really do have a problem, Americans are willing to sacrifice. I mean, I just saw the movie Midway. Oh, my goodness. I mean, think about the sacrifice that generation made, because collectively we decided we've got to fight for all we're worth against the Germans and Japanese to survive as a republic. If we really saw it as a threat, people would make sacrifice. Now, until then, we're all hanging on to our stuff. And so if you say to a grandmother, would you give up a penny out of every dollar of Social Security? They'd say, not a chance. If they're not ever, going to give, and you're going to give, don't gore my ox if everybody's ox isn't getting gored. So the penny plan says, would you give up 1 penny out of every dollar of federal benefit if everybody, and I would stress the word everybody, and all government programs did the same? And my belief is, if people really saw this as a threat, yes, they would. If you do that for just 5 years, we end up back at a balanced budget.
Wow. The penny plan. That's certainly been talked about on the right, but never gotten a ton of traction in the halls of Congress. But it certainly is a concrete approach to dealing with this. A lot of times folks just throw out the fire alarm about the debt, but don't actually have an approach to it, and you certainly do. You mentioned this a moment ago, Governor, but as we head into the 2020 cycle, on the one hand, you've got a Republican president who promised to deal with the debt but has not vetoed a single spending bill. We've now got trillion-dollar deficits, and you and he certainly sparred about spending during your time in your second tour of duty on Capitol Hill. And then now you've got a field of Democrats, as you said, more versus more, who want to greatly expand government, whether it's to run health care for all, provide free tuition at public colleges, Green New Deal, you name it. What's going to be the consequence of essentially doing nothing to contain spending in the years to come, since neither party in Washington seems all that concerned about it?
You and I get burned. Our loved ones get burned. That's what happens. That's reality. And again, we're walking right toward this amazingly predictable financial crisis because nobody's talking about it. But, I mean, the consequences are dire. I mean, if you have insomnia, I got just a book for you. It was written by a professor from Harvard and a professor from Maryland, University of Maryland, and it's called This Time It's Different. And what it did was it looked at the last 800 years of financial history as it relates to governments. And what they found was that in every instance, civilizations get to a tipping point wherein they had to decide, do we go back to what made us competitive and maybe even a world power in the first place? Or do we stay on this happy but ultimately unsustainable cycle of upward government spending, upward government consumption? And 9 times out of 10, they said, let's stick with the comfy route. And it was the seeds of that civilization's undoing. And so I guess what I would say to you is the consequences are dire. I mean, the history is that if you don't proactively deal with this politically, the financial markets will ultimately bring us back to reality. But here's the catch. They don't care whether you're a Republican. They don't care whether you're a Democrat. They don't care about political spin. They just care about whether or not the numbers add up. Ours don't in D.C., and if we leave it to the financial markets to do it for us, it's going to mean loss in your savings account. It's going to be loss in your retirement account. It's going to be loss in the value of your house and loss in opportunity in terms of jobs and other.
Governor, one of the things I mentioned there is the Medicare for All, basically government-run health care that Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and a couple others in the campaign are pushing. Right now, on its current course, Medicare is already scheduled to go insolvent in, 6 or 7 years or so? What happens if we throw every American into that?
It's financial insanity. This is why I thought it was so important to at least try and raise my hand and say, I can't do this. I know I'm not going to become president, but can we at least have a conversation about the fact that we're literally walking off the plank financially? And so what's it going to do? It's going to make the program that much faster, and everybody gives you a different spin as to why that's not the case, but they're not looking at the how do you pay for it side of the equation. It's just a series of different promises. As we just spoke a moment ago, it is literally a debate on the Democratic side of more versus more, and it's complete denial and look the other way on the Republican side.
You've got some economists, Paul Krugman, who I'm sure you agree with all the time, is one of them, who says that, hey, yes, we're running these massive debts, but as long as inflation's in check and people are still investing in the U.S., ultimately the number doesn't matter. What do you tell them?
Even the author of what's called modern monetary theory, and that basically that's what he's latching on to, even the author there, by the design of the theory itself, says that you can't do that if you don't have all of your debt owned by you. And if you look at our public debt, about 40% of our national debt is owned by foreigners. So even by the theory that they're claiming there, they're leaving off the reality of what the theorists laid in laying out the theory, which is you got to own all your own debt. We don't. So I think it's invalidated based on the math behind the theory itself. It's also invalidated by common sense. Are you kidding me? Show me one civilization that has been able to spend and spend and spend and ultimately not undo itself. That's a very thesis behind the book of, This Time It's Different by Reinhardt and Rogoff. Paul Kennedy years ago wrote a great book entitled The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And what he talked about was the way in which economic supremacy was the precursor to military supremacy. You couldn't have one without the other. And so there is no example in the pages of history that says that Krugman's theory is right. Not one. And yet that's what people say with a straight face, and I don't know exactly how they do it.
Last topic, Congressman, and it's a tough one. You mentioned that it's got to kind of be an all-in situation. Nobody's going to want to let their own ox get gored if everybody else doesn't. But one of the things we see when it comes to lawmakers and presidents is the one thing they fear most, of course, is not staying in office. And so the last thing they want to do is offend anyone with budget cuts. And so they get squeamish, even though they might campaign on it when it comes time for budget cuts to happen. Ultimately, if they're going to be serious budget cuts, something they care about is probably going to get affected. And so they tend to get squeamish about it, and then nothing ends up happening. How do we change that?
By everybody listening on this show, sending an email, picking up the phone, writing a letter to the editor, talking to a friend at church or at work or around the kitchen table at home. This is something that we're going to have to force on Washington. To your point, we have a political system that follows, and in fairness to some in it, at times it's designed that way. At times it is people watching out for the one thing that too many care about the most, which is staying in office. The name of the game is staying in the game. And so this is an issue that we're going to have to force on Washington, and it's incumbent upon every one of us, not only looking out for our own financial worth, but for our kids and our grandkids, that we speak up and say enough is enough. You are not leading us over the cliff. No way. I'm going to speak up, and I'm going to look for a way of making noise. That's what this presidential race was an attempt to do. But, I saw there wasn't a road trying to raise the issue in the way that I wanted it raised, and so I'm going to look for other ways. But all of us need to do the same.
Well, as you mentioned, sir, the official campaign might be over, but the effort to get attention to this issue certainly goes on. We thank you for your time today, sir, and we look forward to more conversations down the road. We appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. Take good care. And I tell you one other thing, which is if people want, go to marksanford.com, and they can get more charts and graphs on this front than they ever want to see. Not enough in the way of pretty pictures, but a lot of charts and graphs that would be helpful to drawing your own conclusions.
Absolutely. They're huge numbers, and to put them in perspective, that's very helpful sometimes. Former South Carolina Governor and Congressman Mark Sanford, as he mentioned, marksanford.com. And I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.